Set aside your preconceived notions about the Knights Templar, famous for their fabled treasure and secret rites. The Crusader warriors wore white cloaks with crimson crosses because there is something darker and more profound hidden behind that emblem. The Merovingian bloodline's narrative, a bloodline that has been removed from official history but is still faintly present in symbols, in positions of authority, and possibly in people who currently determine the course of Europe. We'll introduce you to a history you were never taught. Here at Bedtime History, an account of events that were never intended to be uttered out loud. We must start where history and folklore converge in order to comprehend the Merovingian epic. In the 5th century, Gaul was a disordered patchwork, Germanic tribes swarming in from the north and east, barbarian kingdoms changing their rulers like the wind, and the Western Roman Empire tumbling to dust. A name started to reverberate through the oldest chronicles in this tumultuous environment. The Merovingian dynasty is said to have been founded by Meve, who is also the subject of an odd legend that has persisted for more than a millennium. Gregory of Tours, and fragments of folk tradition, a historian, claims that Meve was more than just the son of Frankish warlord King Cly. He also possessed an unearthly quality. According to the legend, the queen went out to the sea while she was pregnant and came across the enigmatic Kinator, or feave-horned sea beast. She returned from that meeting to give birth to Mevik, although no one knows exactly what happened. From then on, the Merovingian lineage was seen as a symbol of divine might and the gods' protection, a marriage of man and a force from the depths. Such a tale was not written off as imagination in the medieval era, when Christianity and previous pagan customs were still mixed together. Instead, it served as a basis for the legitimacy of Merovingian power. If a king was descended from God, then his authority to rule stemmed from a mandate that was beyond mortal reach and that no challenger on earth could contest. In addition to winning battles, Phorians, the Merovingians, maintained this as the central idea of the sacred king. The narrative of the divine king's birth was not the only thing that bore his mark. The long hair of Merovingian emperors served as an outward symbol of their unchallenged power. That hair, according to the Franks, symbolized a ruler's might and his connection to God. A king would lose his legitimacy and be permanently exiled from the kingdom if his hair were shorn. As a result, the king's hair was protected by royal ceremonies with a level of religious observance, making it a live representation of legitimate authority. Many Merovingian artifacts featured the honeybee, another emblem that represents cosmic order and longevity. Bees served as a bridge between the divine and human worlds in ancient symbols, signifying a community united by rigid order and loyalty. This was not a random decision. The idea that the Merovingian realm was based on an unbreakable sacred order was stated purposefully. Long before they lost their throne, the Merovingians had fallen from grace. The Merovingian crown was already vacant when Childeric III ascended to the kingdom in 743. He was a ceremonial figure who was kept in place to maintain the appearance that the line of the sacred kings still existed, but he was not the actual ruler of the Frankish realm. Peppa the Short, the palace's mayor, Charles Martel's son, and the man in charge of the state apparatus held all actual power. Childeric III performed his duties for 8 years, attending royal functions, issuing charters that were written by the scribes of the mayor, and taking any action required to maintain the appearance of Merovingian kingship. But despite his status as a symbol, he continued to stand in the way of Piper's goals. Piper needed more than the title of mayor to justify his power. The crown itself was all he needed. Pepe asked Pope Zachary, appointed inquiry in 750, who ought to rule as king, who is in charge the person with the title, but no actual authority. The Pope's allegedly straightforward and unambiguous response provided Pep with the opportunity he required. The same individual should hold both authority and title. The act of overthrowing a legitimate king in favor of the chief minister of the palace was sanctioned both politically and religiously. A council of aristocrats and clergymen met in Soissons in 751. The deposition of Chelder III was announced. There was no conflict, no rebellion. The final Merovingian king was subtly arrested, and a ceremonial humiliation served as the act of deposition. The hallowed emblem of Frankish royal legitimacy, his long hair, was chopped off. This action did more than only deprive him of his throne. The dynasty's claim to divine authority was broken. Childeric III was transferred to the monastery of Sithwu, then Sparta, following the ritual, where he lived out the remainder of his days in obscurity and solitude. There is no evidence of opposition or a bid to regain the throne, according to him. The dynasty ended with a ceremonial political decision supported by the most potent forces of the time, rather than a devastating war. The Merovingian dynasty officially ended at this point. A new era for the Frankish realm began when the Carolingian line of Pepin the Short replaced it after more than 2 centuries. However, the transition's rather subtle, undramatic quality left an uncomfortable question. What was the reason behind the silent disappearance of a dynasty that claimed hallowed blood? Did they voluntarily withdraw into the shadows to protect something greater than the throne, or had their power been drained out long ago? Centuries of speculation would grow out of that query, connecting the Merovingians to covert power structures and the most well-known medieval order, the Knights Templar, who would later be suspected of protecting the heritage of the Holy Kings Childeric III's overthrow in 751 represented more than just a change in the dynasty. It signaled the start of a concerted effort to remove the Merovingians from popular consciousness as the so-called fine do-nothing monarchs who enjoyed privilege without ruling. The Merovingians' influence was diminished to almost nothing in the centuries that followed by histories authored by church-affiliated chroniclers. On contrast from the Carolingian dynasty, in actuality, this downgrading was more of a political ploy than an impartial assessment. The best method for the new dynasty to defend its takeover of the throne was to portray their forebears as signs of decline, in addition to bolstering their own legitimacy. The Carolingians made the transfer of power seem both necessary and inevitable by portraying the Merovingians as weak and inept. The historical record was severely hollowed out as a result. Many modern descriptions of the Merovingian age have either completely disappeared or have only been preserved in bits. Anecdotes that supported the impression of decadence were the main emphasis of official chronicles, which either ignored or suppressed evidence of their true power. Key papers were prohibited from access by monastic archives, which served as the era's memory keepers. Over time, some of these manuscripts were lost, burned, or allowed to deteriorate. The Merovingians fell into mythology amid the quiet of official history. In the very places they used to control, the legend of Mevic and his ethereal beginnings persisted in local mythology. Even though they were no longer directly associated with the dynasty, its emblems, the honeybee and long hair, continue to appear sporadically in artwork and architectural designs, and anyone who knew what to look for could still recognize them. Imagination flourished due to these gaps in the record, leading to theories that have persisted into the present day. Could there still be records, genealogies, or artifacts demonstrating that the Merovingians never completely disappeared, but instead retreated into the shadows if the majority of their legacy had been destroyed by popular history? In this narrative, the Merovingians emerged as the focal point of a historical undercurrent in which tales of the chosen lineage and latent power were subtly transmitted over the centuries. Erasure from the political scene does not always signify the end of a dynasty. Sometimes intertwined with organizations such as the Knights Templar, it occasionally signifies the change of force into a more subdued, elusive form. And those who are looking for the truth are left to follow the faintest of trails, a carved emblem on stone, a fuzzy line in a manuscript, or a local legend whose origin no one can fully recall when the official record is obscured by darkness. Centuries later, a new force, nocturnal in form but constrained by its own web of power and secret, would emerge from this mist of lost past. Many think that the remnants of the Merovingian legacy were inherited and protected by this army. At this point, the Knights Templar entered the historical arena, a time marked as much by religious zeal as by the vast game of politics and economy. The Crusades began in Europe about 4 centuries after the Merovingian dynasty disappeared from the political scene. Pope Urban II's call to arms in 1096 sparked waves of crusading troops from Christian nations all over the world, with the intention of retaking Jerusalem from the Muslims. With the Christian victory in 1099, the First Crusade came to a conclusion, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem and other Crusader states were established. However, peace did not follow victory. The road of pilgrimage from Europe to the Holy Land was still dangerous. Devoted bands of traders and messengers, nevertheless, had to traverse untamed and treacherous territory where they were at risk of being ambushed, robbed, and killed. A small group of knights took an oath to protect pilgrims with their lives in this environment, the humble fellow warriors of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, eventually known as the Knights Templar, were formed in 1119 by Hug Dion and 8 other friends, with fewer than 10 members and rigorous chastity, poverty, and obedience vows. They were initially far from a powerful force. However, they were bestowed with a remarkable favor from the time of their establishment. They were given housing in a portion of Jerusalem's royal palace, which was constructed on the location of the former Solomon Temple by King Baldwin II. Because of King Solomon's heritage and the First Temple, this location held unmatched holiness for Christendom. It was more than an honor to be housed in one of Jerusalem's holiest places, a place with significant spiritual and symbolic significance. It was a chance. There were tunnels and vaults beneath this location, many of which had not been altered since the time of the Roman and Islamic empires. The Templars held these spaces for almost 10 years, conducting actions that are mostly not documented in official documents, a dark hole in history that has stoked centuries of conjecture. one of the most persistent ideas, contends that the Templars discovered artifacts and old records during this period that might fundamentally alter our perception of Christian history and European power, perhaps containing proof of the Merovingian lineage, survival, and validity. In that case, the Templars would have changed from pilgrim knights to defenders of a secret with power that extended well beyond the cathedral halls and the battlefield. Pope Honorius II legally recognized the Templars within a few years after they were founded, giving them exceptional privileges, tax exemption, autonomy from secular rulers, and sole accountability to the Pope. Their quick ascent to become a powerful military and financial force with a large network of fortifications, banking institutions, and trade routes throughout Europe and the Middle East was made possible by these liberties. However, the Templars were inextricably bound to a complex network of stories and conspiracies because of their unique location in the Temple of Solomon and the unsolved issues surrounding what they discovered there. The purported link to the Merovingians would turn out to be one of the most enduring and unsettling of them, reverberating through folklore to this day. One of the darkest and most contentious periods in the history of the order is still the 10 years that the Knights Templar occupied the location of the Temple of Solomon, from approximately 1119 to 1129. Apart from the claim that they were defending pilgrims, official documents tell us very little about their activity at this time. However, considering their initial number of only 9 men, it would have been extremely difficult to protect hundreds of miles of dangerous road. Centuries of conjecture over their actual purpose beneath the Temple Mount have been stoked by this practical difficulty. The Templars may have conducted surveys and excavations in the old tunnels beneath the site. According to a few oblique sources from the 12th and 13th centuries, these underground passageways were believed to represent the remains of buildings from the time of King Solomon, or, at the very least, from when Jerusalem was under Roman and Byzantine rule. In the imagination of the Middle Ages, the temple was not just a place of worship, but also a storehouse of unfathomable riches and ejoled knowledge, containing religious writings and holy relics of great spiritual significance. The most persistent claim that the Templars discovered records and proof that may append Europe's political and religious order arose from this hole in the record. According to one school of thought, their findings are closely related to the Merovingian dynasty. According to it, the Merovingians might have discovered bloodline evidence, sacred texts, or genealogies that connected the Merovingians to important early Christian figures, possibly even to Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ. If accurate, this would recast the Merovingians as the chosen bloodline, with a claim powerful enough to subvert the authority of the Church itself and the validity of ruling dynasties, rather than as a dethroned medieval family. According to oral histories from southern France, which was formerly a bastion of Merovingians, the Templars brought big wooden chests from Jerusalem back to Europe and concealed them in fortified fortresses, especially in the areas of Languedoc and Aragon, as if to protect something of exceptional importance. Contemporary scholars observe that a number of Templar fortifications in these regions were either built or significantly strengthened shortly after their return from the Holy Land. Even though there isn't any archaeological evidence to support the theory, skepticism is nonetheless stoked by the Templars' abrupt increase in riches and power following their stay at the Temple Mount. Their treasure might have been knowledge rather than cash or jewelry. Furthermore, a secret can have greater influence in politics and religion than any amount of money. It would be simpler to comprehend the Templars' subsequent privileges, such as direct PayPal protection and freedom from secular law, if they actually possessed evidence of the legitimacy of the Merovingian bloodlines. However, they would also pose a latent threat to popes and kings alike if they kept such a secret. Furthermore, history would show that in the brutal world of medieval power, having a terrible truth may be just as deadly as losing a fight. The Knights Templar left Jerusalem and gained papal sanction in the early 12th century, at which point they started building one of the most intricate and vast power structures in the medieval world. They were renowned as an elite military organization at the beginning. However, they transformed into a multi-purpose organization in a few decades, a banking system, an army, and a logistical network that spans both Europe and the Middle East all at once. They constructed hundreds of strongholds, from strategically positioned fortifications in Languedoc, Aragon, and Portugal, to enormous strongholds, Le Croc, des Chevaliers, in Syria. In addition to being a military installation, each stronghold functioned as a granary, an administrative center, and occasionally a safe haven for artifacts of unknown but suspected importance. Soon after returning from Solomon's Temple, their sites were built or strengthened in France, particularly in the south, which was previously a Merovingian heartland. Some researchers have questioned if these stone vaults were meant to protect whatever legacy they had discovered because of the timing. However, the Templars' strength was never limited to their walls and swords. They established the first international financial network in Europe. Merchants and pilgrims could use encrypted letters of credit to withdraw money in Acre or Antioch after depositing it at a Templar preceptor in Paris. In a time when overland travel was fraught with peril, this invention provided previously unheard of safety and speed. By controlling enormous cash flows, this method allowed the Templars to lend to popes and rulers alike, receiving protection, favors, and infrequent exemptions from secular government in exchange. This network assumed a further function in the ideas that connected them to the Merovingians, defending those who are said to be descended from the holy monarchs. The Templars were able to hide and relocate important individuals, papers, and relics associated with them out of the hands of adversary powers because of their PayPal immunity and unrestricted cross-border travel. According to certain esoteric literature, a branch of the Merovingian bloodline survived through the Templars, subtly becoming part of the European nobility and continuing to have an impact in the background for generations. Some academics believe that the order's internal system of rites and symbols is a subliminal nod to Merovingian ancestry. The famous Red Cross would occasionally be seen next to honeybee or fleur-de-lis emblems that were formerly connected to the Frankish dynasty. Their frequent appearance in Templar architecture, emblems, and manuscripts points to a coded language that only members of the circle could understand, even though no official record explains this connection. When combined, the Templars' strongholds, financial hegemony, political independence, and unparalleled mobility made them an unstoppable power that neither a king nor a pope could completely subdue. They posed an existential threat to the status quo, however, Because of these advantages, as well as the suspicion that they were hiding secrets that could change the course of history. Furthermore, it was uncommon for any organization that accumulated such riches, autonomy, and hazardous knowledge to dissolve peacefully in the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, when the majority of people were illiterate and books were considered rare treasures, architecture and iconography served primarily as ornamentation. They had a language. With their extensive network of commanderies, churches, and fortifications throughout Europe, the Knights Templar were fluent in this language. It occasionally conveyed the Church's official message, but other times it delivered a more covert message that only a few people could understand. According to the theories that connected them to the Merovingians, the memory of the selected lineage was kept through this secret language of stone and stained glass. Numerous Templar locations have recurrent themes that symbolic scholars have discovered. The order's official emblem, the Red Cross, occasionally coexists with images of fleur-de-lis, or honeybees, both of which are strongly associated with Mayan ancestry and heraldry. Some churches have arches and columns with carved fish or wave designs that evoke the myth of Meroving's enigmatic seaborne beginnings. These appeared to be artistic embellishments to the untrained eye. They were purposeful symbols of a royal lineage to people who were familiar with the tale. Templar churches are known for their stained glass, which also conceals some of their flaws. Some windows show crowned rulers without any distinguishing titles, their hair cascading to their shoulders, unlike the hairstyles of modern monarchs. Bees or dim six-pointed stars may be visible in the background, too faint to raise suspicions, yet visible to anyone looking for them. The architecture itself evolved into a cipher. Circular or octagonal shapes, which are linked to perfection and eternity, were used in the construction of many Templar cathedrals and strongholds. However, some historians interpret these shapes as representing the point where the divine and terrestrial worlds meet, as though the entire Templar network served as a memory map etched onto the terrain. Certain Templar locations seem to line up in straight lines or create geometric forms when plotted on a map, linking ancient Merovingian centers. Such symbols could be written off as coincidence if they just happened once or twice. However, its recurrence, spanning many centuries and a wide geographic area, supports the dual symbolism theory. According to this perspective, the Templars carried out their covert duty to maintain the Merovingian myth in a form that was difficult for a king or pope to censure or destroy, all the while fulfilling their public function as the Church's financial and military wing. The Merovingian tradition was preserved via art and architecture without the use of parchment. It could be concealed in a stained glass window, a carved sculpture, or the concealed axis between building items that are visible to everyone but can only be read by those who possess the key. Additionally, because such language was silent, it survived purges, inquisitions, and the strictures of official history. Political power, however, could not endure for generations, but symbols could. When the Templar network peaked, their power and independence started to worry the Pope and kings. And if there was a legacy they had safeguarded, it would be put to the ultimate test when that uneasiness became action. Following one crusade after another, the Knights Templar emerged as a vital power in the Christian world of the Middle Ages. In addition to leading military operations, they served as the foundation of the financial, transportation, and logistical networks that allowed the Holy Land to be conquered and ruled. Their reach stretched from European ports like Marseille and La Rochelle to frontline outposts like Gaza and Safat, as well as the walled island of Cyprus and the powerful cities of Vakar and Antioch. The Templars brought more than just swords and lances to every new expedition. They carried a whole network of trade, along with luxury items like spices, silks, and glassware. They coordinated the movement of food, grain, and firearms from the East to Europe. They were able to acquire the Byzantine and Islamic fortified building skills and learn sophisticated medical procedures, mathematics, navigation, and even sophisticated administrative systems as a result of their position as cultural and technological conduits. They gained two clear strategic advantages as a result. Their financial and military might increased first. Templar strongholds developed into the most sophisticated defensive structures of their era, and their finance system enabled armies to conduct protracted wars without being totally reliant on the king's treasury. Secondly, their network of trade served as a secret conduit for communications. Under the Red Cross banner, which few would dare to violate, letters, documents, and even artifacts could travel thousands of miles. According to the Merovingian theory, this produced the ideal system for preserving and protecting any heritage or trade secrets the Templars may have picked up from their time spent under Solomon's temple. Without being noted in official history, genealogical documents, symbolic artifacts, or even real people, if any, existed, may be transported between continents via Templar-controlled pathways. They went well beyond the function of a religious order thanks to their intellectual, military, and economic endeavors. With wealth comparable to entire kingdoms, they emerged as a supranational force that was not entirely reliant on any one king or pope. Since the Templars controlled not only the land, but also the flow of money and strategically important information, they frequently eclipsed local government. However, it was precisely this extensive network and autonomy that sowed the seeds of their demise. Suspicion and envy, together with the will to destroy, invariably follow an organization's growth in riches, military prowess, and possession of secrets that other powers cannot access or control. However, the Templars would make sure their legacy was firmly established before that reckoning. And if the hypothesis of their Merovingian link is correct, they ensured that the secret would not perish with their order at the height of their power. A covert directive was executed simultaneously throughout the French realm on Friday, October 13, 1307. Every Knight Templar, within the boundaries of King Philip IV, often known as Philip the Fair or Philip le Bel, was ordered to be arrested. Templar strongholds were encircled, church doors were sealed, and knights of all ranks, from high commanders to lowly gatekeepers, were hauled away in shackles from the streets of Paris to the most isolated rural areas. An order that was once regarded as a cornerstone of Western Christianity was transformed into an adversary of the faith in the course of one night. Heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, and the practice of profane ceremonies were the official allegations. Even still, many people at the time questioned whether these charges were more than a front. Philip IV was actually deeply indebted, with a large portion of that debt coming from the Templar treasury which had funded his wars. he was able to take possession of the enormous fortune and property that the order possessed in France as well as eliminate his debts thanks to the purge. However, money could not have been the whole story. According to the Merovingian theory, Philip IV and his supporters, notably Pope Clement V, who was also greatly influenced by the French crown, aimed to destroy the secrets that the Templars protected as a threat. The power of the Church and the dynasties that ruled Europe at the time could be overthrown if the order actually possessed records or evidence confirming the legitimacy of a selected bloodline, like the Merovingians. It was a brutal sweep. Numerous knights were coerced into admitting to crimes that historians have since shown to be ludicrous or obviously false. Grand Master Jacques de Molay and other high-ranking officials were imprisoned for years before being executed by burning at the stake in 1314. Legend has it that de Molay cursed Clement and Philip as the flames engulfed him. In an odd turn of events, both men died within a year. However, a riddle that has never been answered was left behind by the purging. The majority of the Templar records and wealth were never found. According to modern reports, some members left Paris with big wooden trunks and disappeared in the hours preceding the arrests. Since then, the same question has been posed by both treasure hunters and historians. Did they escape with riches and silver, or with secrets that could have thrown the medieval world into disarray? Since then, the events of Friday the 13th, 1307, have come to represent political conspiracy and treachery. They put a stop to the Templars' public life. They might have pushed what they protected farther beneath, though if the Merovingian connection is genuine. According to history, an order's core, network, knowledge, and purpose can all be destroyed while its body remains intact. The Templars, or at least their inner circle, would then enter a new phase when they would remain hidden from the light, yet continue to have a lasting impact on Europe for centuries to come. Many people thought that the Knights Templar had completely disappeared following the Purge in 1307. Actually, it was just the end of the portion of the order that was accessible to the public. The Templars' richest war, plundered, their fortifications were taken, and their military and administrative apparatus in France was dismantled. However, they couldn't destroy the extensive network they had up over more than 2 centuries, including their land holdings, manpower, affiliations with aristocratic houses, and complex intelligence conduits in a single night. The destiny of the Templar was less dire in kingdoms outside Philip IV's direct sphere of influence. Many knights sought safety in Portugal, Scotland, and parts of Germany. Much of the property, staff, and rights of the ancient order, many of which were thought to be direct inheritances from the Templars, were still held by the whole Templar branch in Portugal after it was revived under the new name of the Order of Christ. Legend has it that runaway knights in Scotland, where the king failed to implement the papal decree, were taken in by local lords and participated in pivotal conflicts like Bannockburn in 1314. The Red Cross of the Templars vanished from public flags, but it continued to exist in more subdued forms, such as carved into church masonry, inlaid into floor tiles, or concealed inside illuminated manuscripts. The Merovingians were previously associated with specific dual symbols. In later structures, architecture, and even in the customs of secret societies that arose centuries later, the honeybee, the fleur-de-lis, and the wave motif persisted, as noble heraldry. According to some beliefs, before the purge started, the Templar inner-circled those who actually knew the secrets and legacy of the order purposefully withdrew into the shadows. The notion that some of the treasure was taken away to safety is supported by the enormous wooden trunks that vanished from Paris shortly before Friday the 13th. According to the Merovingian idea, they were protecting records, genealogies, or artifacts connected to the sacred king's lineage, rather than just gold or bullion. Legend began to surround the Templars' name in the 14th century. They served as protectors of secret vaults, buried treasure, and journeys to far-off places in popular legends. They were portrayed in esoteric circles as the custodians of old knowledge, transferring it to subsequent secret societies like the Priory of Sion or the Freemasons. One thing is certain, regardless of the reality. In order to survive in a new world where sometimes hidden power could surpass obvious power, the Templars, or at least their legacy, underwent a transformation rather than disappearing. The memory of the Merovingians, if it was retained by them, also followed a similar trajectory, disappearing from official histories but continuing to exist in symbols, rituals, and unspoken traditions like a closed circle. The narrative then belonged to the broader current of European history, rather than merely a dynasty or order of knights. Occasionally, a current emerges to remind the world of a power that is never completely forgotten. When the Merovingian role was all but erased by official history, their memory persisted through the silent conduits of oral tradition, symbols, and carefully guarded rites, rather than in royal libraries or church archives. The tale of the long-haired kings persisted in being told in areas that had formerly been their domain, particularly in southern France, sometimes as a legend by the fire, and other times as a warped piece of history that had been passed down through the ages. The villagers talked about a unique bloodline that had governed in the past but was later betrayed. Its descendants are still anonymous and live among common people. These stories frequently have faint, distinguishing symbols: a family with exceptionally long hair, an antique coat of arms with a honeybee, or an odd sign carved into a church entryway without a formal explanation. These were only charming tidbits of local folklore to outsiders. They were pieces of a much bigger story to those who understood. The Merovingian memory was more methodically kept in esoteric societies. The chosen bloodline was associated with symbolic rites held by some secret societies that were purported to be the direct or spiritual descendants of the Knights Templar. Their rituals could include reciting passages that alluded to the dynasty's magical beginnings, including the honeybee or fleur-de-lis into their regalia, or reenacting the coronation of a Merovingian monarch. These ideas frequently mention Shanspremery, the Freemasons, and other mysterious orders. There is little direct proof, however. The idea that these are the custodians of the legacy has been strengthened by the recurrent emblems and heraldic themes, as well as the distinct connections between members and old aristocratic families. They never declare openly that they are on a mission to defend the Merovingians. However, there are sporadic hints in their lodge architecture, internal records, and even their leaders' speeches that are believed to reference that exact goal. It seems that some of these societies created their rituals as a way to transmit information in code. They are simply serious, occult displays to an outsider. They disclose a deeper meaning to an initiate who has been instructed in the tale and its symbolism. In this way, a memory can endure for generations, despite being denied by all formal institutions. What was left of the Merovingian tradition evolved into an indivisible synthesis of esoteric practice, village law, and historical reality over time. It is almost impossible to tell the difference between embellishment and evidence, since the strands are so entwined. However, the myth has remained resilient because of this very uncertainty. Proof is not necessary for its existence. Only the act of being recounted, recalled, and ingrained in forms that individuals unknowingly come into contact with on a daily basis. Through the ages, the Merovingian legacy continues to flow like a subterranean river. From fireside stories in remote hamlets to solitary ceremonies in shadowed lodges, and occasionally it comes to light to remind us that some periods of history have never really slept, rather than to disclose the whole truth. Europe had entered a period of contradiction by the 19th century. On one side, modernity's precision was being used to reshape society through industrialization and empirical research. The Romantic movement, on the other hand, was arousing intense nostalgia, a longing for the heroic past and the air of forgotten legend. This provided an ideal environment for the centuries-old Merovingian tale to resurface in popular culture. Once the center of Merovingian power, France saw a rise in national historical revivalism that looked for roots that went back before the Carolians or the Capsians. The long-haired rulers were portrayed by Romantic historians and authors like Ostinieri and Jules Michelet as symbols of an old French identity, reimagining the Franks' history with dignity and mystery. Simultaneously, recently established archaeological societies started uncovering royal graves, such as those of Clovis I and Dagobert I, igniting public interest in a dynasty that had long been marginalized in popular history. However, the Merovingian Renaissance spread beyond the academic world. Europe was awash with secret organizations and occult movements by the middle of the 9th century, ranging from minor esoteric circles to the Freemasons and Rosicrucians. Many of these groups started to insinuate themselves into the chosen bloodlines, legends implying or explicitly asserting that they were the keepers of the Merovingian heritage. The Priory of Sion, a mysterious institution rumored to have existed for generations, safeguarding proof of a lineage extending from Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene to the Merovingian rulers, was one of the most alluring names. In the meantime, historical research and archaeological discoveries were frequently shrouded in mystery. Some artifacts and jewelry with fleur-de-lis or honeybee engravings were seen as evidence that Merovingian symbolism had persisted in French culture. These findings were quickly embraced by secret societies, which incorporated them into their own symbolic frameworks and used them to strengthen initiates' belief that they were the heirs of a holy legacy. The Merovingians reappeared in literature and art in a mysterious and romanticized form. In addition to depicting the long-haired rulers in solemn profile or recreating the crowning of Clovis III, painters added features not found in historical accounts, such as a fish, a swarm of bees, or a ripple motif, all of which subtly alluded to the dynasty's fabled supernatural beginnings. These visual signals appear to be intended for a viewer who is familiar with the esoteric world's symbolic language. From a historical dynasty the Merovingians became a cultural phenomenon through the fusion of archaeology, romantic literature, and esoteric tradition. This resulted in a multi-layered emblem that served as both a cipher for beliefs of hidden power and secret bloodlines, and a symbol of national heritage. By the end of the century, the long-haired king's image had returned to the public consciousness of Europe, this time as a part of an incomplete story, rather than just a historical chapter. By the 20th century, the Merovingian tale had spread into a whole new field, popular culture, instead of the exclusive realm of academic publications and secret clubs. During this time, print, radio, and subsequently television started to significantly influence the world's imagination. The Merovingian legend was revived, modified, and disseminated more quickly than ever before within that wave. Esoteric authors started writing books in the early decades that connected the Merovingians to some of the most contentious issues in history: Christianity's beginnings, the Holy Grail myth, and the medieval secret orders. These publications created dramatic narratives in which the long-haired monarchs were not only temporal rulers, but also heirs to a sacred inheritance that had the power to change the global order by fusing historical study with audacious speculation. The release of Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln's Holy Grail in the 1980s marked a turning point. Based on a combination of historical records, occult customs, and thought-provoking theories, the book popularized the notion that the Merovingians could be direct descendants of Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ. It became a publishing sensation, pushing the legend well beyond the boundaries of academia and exclusive circles, while being denounced by conventional historians. Television and films also had a role. The Merovingians started to appear in European and American documentaries about the secrets of history as a component of a covert power structure that connected the past and present. Even if the name was changed to fit the story, the Merovingian narrative's unmistakable imprint was frequently present in fictional works through ancient bloodlines, with a shadowy influence and mysterious codes incorporated into architecture and art. The development of the Internet at the end of the century created the ideal environment for these notions to thrive. Discussion groups, specialized websites, and online forums arose where fans shared pictures, maps, and symbol interpretations that connected the Merovingians to anything from contemporary political schemes to the Knights Templar and the Holy Grail. The distinction between fact and fiction became increasingly hazy during this process. Unverified facts started to gain momentum and were repeated frequently enough to become part of the communal memory. As a result, the Merovingian myth became a cultural phenomenon and a case study of how history can change and spread uncontrollably once it has been filtered through the media. All of this prepared the way for the leap that would occur in the early 21st century, when a single work of fiction that was heavily based on the Merovingian legend would cause a worldwide craze that would bring the myth to the attention of hundreds of millions of people and guarantee that it would never completely fade into obscurity again. When Don Brown's The Da Vinci Code was published in 2003, it caused a global cultural upheaval. The book sold tens of millions of copies and was translated into other languages in a few months, making it a publishing sensation. By 2006, viewers all over the world were treated to breathtaking views of Gothic buildings, Renaissance artwork, and religious rules, thanks to the film adaptation. The theory that the Merovingian bloodline was the direct descendant of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene, and that this knowledge had been methodically buried for centuries with the Da Vinci Code, was hidden beneath the fast-paced, suspenseful plot of its thriller. Once limited to hidden societies and a select group of alternative historians, the story suddenly attracted hundreds of millions of people. Brown reimagined elements from Holy Blood, Holy Grail, the Knights Templar, the Priory of Sion, and the Holy Grail as a bloodline symbol, as parts of a high-stakes urgent treasure quest. By doing this, he brought the Merovingians into the forefront of the world's popular imagination and lifted them out of the shadows of historical obscurity. For those who were interested in buried history, this surge presented an unparalleled opportunity. The number of books, documentaries, and television shows about the Templars, the Merovingians, and associated theories increased. Locations connected to the mythology. Most famously, southern France's Rennes-le-Tau became a popular tourist site for academics and the general public. As a romantic and contentious mystery, the chosen bloodline entered cultural life and sparked many discussions, both in public and privately. However, there was also a possibility that the story might fade into the mists of fiction due to the phenomenon's speed and scope. Many saw the Da Vinci Code as an entertainment product rather than a starting point for in-depth study. Verifiable historical facts started to be obscured and occasionally replaced with details that were made up or exaggerated for the plot. The distinction between academia and narrative was dissolved by the mingling of evidence and fiction, which facilitated the spread of intentional errors as well as misconceptions. Strong rebuttals were issued by major historians and religious organizations, who rejected the book's assertions as sensationalism without any merit. However, history has demonstrated that efforts to stifle or undermine a narrative frequently backfire, since attempting to destroy a narrative has historically frequently helped its survival. The act of criticizing the Da Vinci Code simply served to increase public curiosity. The Da Vinci Code ultimately left behind two legacies. On the one hand, it was the driving force behind the Merovingian riddle, being one of the world's most well-known historical conundrums. Conversely, it covered the topic with a layer of commercialized fiction that made it much harder to distinguish fact from fiction. It became both a fantastic chance to attract attention and a difficult responsibility to lead audiences through the tangle of theories, symbols, and creative innovation for those who were looking for historical truth. Since then, no party or scholar has been able to control the Merovingian tale. In the world of imagination, it became a communal property, an incomplete mosaic to which anybody, from scholars to ordinary readers, may contribute a tile. The Merovingian narrative was no longer just a historical enigma as it entered the public eye. Current hypotheses have started to connect this selected lineage to the structure of political and economic power that is forming the modern world. The main principle is straightforward. Through matrimonial ties and distinct financial networks, Merovingian ancestors may have assimilated into Europe's political and economic elite and consequently the world stage, retaining their power. According to this theory, the Merovingians' continued existence does not necessarily mean that they are ready to retake a throne in the conventional sense. Alternatively, their impact could be seen through contemporary avenues, positions on boards of centuries-old financial organizations, authority over cross-border trusts, or unofficial advising services to governments and global organizations. Certain modern aristocratic families and lineages linked to the Merovingians share genealogical similarities, according to some independent researchers who contend that these relationships are unlikely to be completely coincidental. In terms of economics, these theories frequently concentrate on London, Zurich, and Luxembourg, three of Europe's oldest financial centers, where institutions with centuries-old histories continue to be entangled with aristocratic families or dynasties, linked by intricate marriage ties to royalty. A surviving Merovingian branch may have indirectly influenced international finance by influencing currency markets, investment flows, and political campaign funding. If it had assimilated into these networks, the theories become more sensitive. In the political arena, according to certain writers, people of Merovingian heritage might have important roles in organizations like the European Union, NATO, or powerful think tanks that influence foreign policy. They would have access to the levers of power without needing to be in the public eye, thanks to generational strategic marriages and an elite networking culture. However, the lack of publicly available, verifiable evidence is a common obstacle to all of these arguments. Although it is practically hard to obtain DNA samples from reigning or noble families, bloodlines can theoretically be traced using genetic technologies. Moreover, any genealogical overlaps that lack supporting evidence are often written off as coincidental. The hypothesis is both disputed and alluring because of the lack of evidence, which encourages conjecture and reinterpretation. There is little doubt that Merovingian is still a latent power brand in terms of symbolism and culture. Invoking a bloodline with strong historical roots can be a subtle technique to indicate rank during ceremonial occasions, closed-door summits, and diplomatic receptions. Whether authentic or not, the Merovingian story has evolved into a distinct layer of meaning in the context of world politics and economics, where folklore, history, and the forces of influence converge to form a network that is hard to see but impossible to completely ignore. For cities Paris, Brussels, London, and the Vatican stand out if we were to map out the current European power structure. Each city has a unique meaning when analyzed through the lens of the Merovingian hypothesis. They are more than just the capitals or main offices of global organizations. They are places where currents of financial, religious, political, and symbolic power converge. According to many perspectives, following the unification of the Frankish tribes, Clovis I selected Paris, the present capital of France, and the historic center of the Frankish realm, as his seat of authority. This is the Basilica of St-Denis, a key location in the legend and the final burial place of France's monarchs. According to some scholars, the city's street layouts and architectural design still contain hidden axes and symbols that allude to this history. Paris is still a center of politics and culture today. An enthusiastic audience can be found here for any story concerning royal lineage. Decisions that impact hundreds of millions of people are decided in Brussels, the European capital and home to NATO and the European Union's headquarters. Numerous noble houses in Belgium and Luxembourg have close marriages to European dynasties, including lineages that were formerly associated with the Merovingians. Their involvement in Brussels' political and economic life supports the notion that this city may be a crucial component of a medieval-era power structure. London is a major global capital city with a financial district that is rather autonomous. Here, European nobility has a complicated past with centuries-old banks and investment houses. Although London was never ruled by the Franks, proponents of the Merovingian hypothesis note that the dynasty's influence may have permeated its power structures through trade networks and marriage ties. The most intricate node of all is the Vatican, which serves as the Catholic Church's spiritual hub. The Vatican would be both the organization with the most incentive to conceal or suppress the proof and a potential guardian ophit if the Merovingian theory connecting the lineage to Jesus and Mary Magdalene is accurate. A maze of closely kept records. The Vatican's hidden vaults have long stoked conjecture about what should never be made public. Some academics imagine a network of private conferences, trust funds, banking, consortia, official and unofficial routes, and even religious or cultural events acting as separate gathering places for people with similar origins or interests when these four locations are connected on a map. The notion that Paris, Brussels, London, and the Vatican constitute a connected lattice, connected to a hidden inheritance, guarantees that the Merovingian theory will endure in the collective imagination, even though there is no concrete evidence of such a power quadrangle. Furthermore, the most fascinating aspect of that hypothetical network is what flows underneath rather than what is visible. Minutes, never documented connections, and agreements were never publicly announced. The Merovingian story finds its most persistent foothold in the area between the map's visible lines and the invisible threads underneath. Journalists, independent historians, esoteric academics, and even amateur investigative organizations have attempted to identify the Merovingian thread in the structure of contemporary power during the past century. They have read over faded monastic documents, searched through genealogies, examined ancient buildings for hidden meanings, and cross-referenced information on European aristocratic lineages. But a strange pattern shows up. The majority of these attempts abruptly end, as though an imperceptible barrier were preventing any further advancement. Some had a more ominous tone, while others ended for more commonplace causes, like lack of funds or disinterest. Investigators have reported that important witnesses abruptly and inexplicably withdrew, or FDA files disappeared after requests were made to national archives. Discreet advice was sometimes given to study teams, cautioning them that continuing would cause problems for all parties. A team in southern France claimed to have discovered a collection of records connecting a local noble family to the Merovingians spanning centuries in the 1970s, which is one of the most frequently cited cases. The complete collection was taken in an unexplained break-in before they could publish. The press story swiftly faded into obscurity, and the authorities were never able to identify the criminal. Researchers have documented data disappearances in more recent decades, such as electronic records being deleted without explanation, email archives ending up missing from accounts, or entire sets of digital photos of original papers getting corrupted. Even while these occurrences could have commonplace causes, their regularity in this setting has created a pattern that is too strong to be dismissed with ease. Of course, it is impossible to say with certainty that there was a coordinated conspiracy. However, the motivation for information restriction would be clear if the theory that the Merovingians and modern power structures are related is correct. Any information that could threaten legitimacy or upend established power structures would be fiercely guarded, often through means that fell well short of direct interference. Paradoxically, the narrative is perpetuated by the very rejection or impediment of these questions. Every unsuccessful effort does not, in the public's opinion, refute the notion. Rather, it strengthens the notion that there must be something to conceal. As a result, the Merovingian myth remains in a condition of suspension, where every void is filled with conjecture and imagination. Maybe this is why, even if the truth is out there, it is unlikely to be revealed in its entirety. In a different way, though, this very ambiguity guarantees that the Merovingian story will endure forever, simply changing in shape as it is passed down to each new generation of seekers. The idea of a selected lineage has had a special appeal throughout human history. It combines hereditary biology with symbolic storytelling, combining physical authority from the outside world with an ethereal atmosphere of holiness. The mystical underpinnings of their beginnings add to this allure for the Merovingians. The honeybee as a representation of immortality, the story of Meve and the enigmatic sea creature, and the precious long hair that could never be shorn. Whether true or not, these characteristics helped to establish the Merovingians as a dynasty whose authority sprang from a heavenly mandate above and beyond the bounds of earthly law. In addition to their military might, the appeal of the chosen bloodline stems from a fundamental psychological need, the human yearning to think of a higher order in which individuals chosen by fate are given authority. This idea had the potential to stabilize communities throughout antiquity and the Middle Ages. As a sign of submission to the will of God, subjects obeyed the king. The feeling endures in more subdued forms in the present day, such as admiration for ancient dynasties, regal iconography, or painstakingly preserved genealogy. However, there is a lot of risk associated with this concept's attraction alone. A group's claims or perceptions of having chosen blood can be used as a means of establishing control, stifling competition, and defending behavior that goes beyond accepted moral limits. Numerous instances of governments and political movements using this idea to establish control, start conflicts, or repress opponents may be seen throughout history. In the case of the Merovingians, the narrative's elusiveness increases the threat. Verification becomes practically impossible, because a large portion of the data is in the hazy area between history and folklore. This allows those who want to profit from the tale to freely choose only the information that suits their needs, ignore unfavorable facts, and create a version of reality that is suited to their political or financial objectives. Such a tale can spread incredibly quickly in today's globalized, media-rich world, winning people over before the facts can catch up. Long before they think about its veracity, the audience is captivated by its emotional draw, which blends legendary grandeur with historical mystery. The selected bloodline might be used as a weapon by an organized power group to sway public opinion, reorganize coalitions, or even tip the political scales. Therefore, the Merovingian mythology is more than just an intriguing cultural riddle or an odd historical artifact. It is a striking illustration of how an idea can both stoke the human imagination and have sufficient sway to mold and even control society, regardless of its factual foundations. And for this very reason, a lot of people think that once the secret of such a chosen lineage is known, it will always be kept hidden or preserved at all costs. An undercurrent ophraphy, vague prophecies strewn across monastic writings, tidbits of folklore, mystical poetry, and cryptic texts preserved within secret societies, permeates the veil that surrounds the Merovingian narrative. Although the specifics vary from one source to another, they all agree on one concept: the selected bloodline will eventually reappear, bringing with it a significant metamorphosis. According to legend, one of the earliest of these prophecies came from the former Merovingian fortress of Languedoc in southern France. According to a text from the 13th century that is still preserved in a remote monastery, the heir of the sea will emerge when the old light is reawakened and darkness falls on the west. Although there is no definition for the ancient light, many people see it as a metaphor for the resuscitation of a lost heritage. These prophecies became the property of later secret societies, especially those thought to be the Templar tradition's descendants. A secret king will appear to restore order according to lyrics or incantations recited by initiates in some closed rites. Here, order refers to a sacred order, a system that is believed to have existed from pre-Christian times and is currently superseded by the dominant power structures, rather than the rules of the modern world. Interestingly, similar predictions have reappeared amid crises in Europe. New iterations of the prophecy, which conveyed the idea that present upheavals were only precursors of a bigger return, subtly spread during the French Revolution, the religious wars, and even the world wars. This tenacity implies that such prophecies remain because they provide a profound psychological need during uncertain times, regardless of their historical authenticity. The conviction that a chosen person will show up to make things right. The biggest advantage of these projections is their ambiguity. In the absence of precise dates, locations, or names, they cannot be verified or definitively refuted. The prophecy is a versatile instrument for upholding beliefs or furthering political objectives, since each generation is free to reinterpret it in its own environment. As a result, the prophecy of the Merovingians' return endures in the minds of people who think history has never really ended, in addition to being preserved in fragile manuscripts and obscure writings, since their disappearance was merely a long gap before the next chapter starts. If the story is accurate, it was never the last chapter. Suppose that one day, amid the chaos of the middle of the 21st century, someone comes out too openly, and not just verbally state that they are a direct descendant of the Merovingians, in addition to royal artifacts that fit descriptions in early chronicles, and even DNA analysis, cross-reference with remains from confirmed royal tombs. They present an uninterrupted genealogical record preserved over centuries. If such an event were to occur, it would cause a seismic upheaval in the media, global politics, and religious communities. In addition to scholarly circles, reactions would be divided politically. This could spark nationalist identity politics, or calls for the restoration of the monarchy in France and other European nations that still have constitutional monarchs. Traditionalists may present it as a chance to re-establish the sacred order that had been disrupted by history. Democratic regimes, on the other hand, would probably try to reduce its political influence, since they are cautious of anything that would upset the status quo. Such a claimant's appearance may even be diplomatically or legally suppressed in nations where monarchy is a touchy subject. The religious situation could grow even more difficult, particularly inside the Roman Catholic Church. There would be a theological earthquake if the Merovingian lineage could be shown to be connected to contentious beliefs about Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ. The Vatican may have to make a difficult decision: either reject the assertion and take steps to undermine it, or try to reframe the narrative and incorporate it into accepted dogma. Either option runs the potential of causing internal divisions between those who accept the revelation and others who believe it to be harmful or heretical. The event would create a media frenzy. The story would be aired globally by major news outlets within hours of the announcement. Images, videos, and many comments would flood social media. Documentaries, dramatizations, and talk shows would all come out one after the other. There would be hundreds of different versions of the story, some based on fact, others on wild speculation, and some on pure fiction. It would be nearly hard to tell fact from fiction in such a whirlpool of information. The danger of instrumentalization would also exist. The Merovingian may be used as a unifying symbol or as a dividing tool by political, economic, and religious groups. The person may be courted to support or oppose important initiatives, invited to speak at international summits, or used as a negotiating chip in private talks. Depending on how they and their handlers decided to handle the attention, they may either become a unifying or polarizing figure. In the end, the question is whether the restoration of a sacred king, even in symbolic form, could actually be accommodated in the modern world with its firmly established political structures, global alliances, and precarious power dynamics. Or may such an appearance set off a series of new battles where politics, religion, history, and the media meet in a disorderly tempest that is impossible to control. History alone has never been the Merovingian story. It is located in the liminal region between what is believable and what is verifiable. We have solidly documented facts. On the one hand, before being overthrown in 751, the Merovingian dynasty dominated a large portion of Western Europe for more than 200 years. Remaining royal tombs, artifacts, and some documents offer a strong historical foundation. However, the flesh that covers that structure is derived from prophecies, occult ritual, folklore, and unproven hypotheses in which fact and fiction blend together until they are nearly indistinguishable. The story finds its most lasting vitality in this gray area. It is not diminished by the lack of conclusive evidence. Instead, it encourages creativity to fill in the blanks. Anybody who approaches the Merovingian story can choose their own interpretation of reality to fit their beliefs or objectives. The historian looks for pieces in archives. The mystic interprets signs, while the audience appreciates it as an unsolved mystery. The filmmaker turns it into a screenplay. This is also the reason why all attempts to resolve the story end in failure. One theory does not disappear when it is proven false. It only changes, fusing with fresh pieces and anchoring itself to any remaining spaces. The gray area is ideal for legend, since it is both closed enough that no one can claim a definitive conclusion and open enough for anyone to contribute. Living in this gray area has additional benefits for the residents of Merovin. It protects the narrative from complete control. The enigma would vanish if all the facts were revealed. However, when maintained in this half-false, half-true state, it continues to be intriguing and complex, always beckoning investigation. This is the perfect condition for a legend to endure the passage of time, changes in governments, and social upheavals. For the Merovingian story to be powerful, it need not be totally accurate. Its power is in the concerns it raises about authority, history, and the ways in which stories are either revealed or kept secret. And the Merovingians will linger on in the collective imagination as a warning that the past never truly ends as long as those questions are not resolved. All it does is wait for a new form to awaken. It is like standing in front of an old painting that has been eroded by time when we examine the Merovingian saga through the prism of easily accessible historical documents and archaeology. There are still some vibrant parts. When Childeric III was overthrown in 751, the coronation records the triumphs of Clovis I, the sacred long hair. However, there are large spaces between these intact strokes where the paint has either been purposefully covered up or has naturally flaked away. The portion we are permitted to see is what we see: the government records, the museum-curated artifacts, and the surviving architectural masterpieces. This is the surface layer that has been securely filtered and organized to create a cohesive narrative in accordance with recognized historical norms. It is the section of the work that is displayed in a brightly lighted gallery that is open to everyone. What has been concealed or eliminated is what we cannot see. Oral histories preserved solely among a few families or hidden orders, manuscripts buried deep in monastic libraries that few are allowed to touch, genealogy sanitized of specific names, and records lost in battle or discreetly misplaced from archives. These could contain fragments that could completely change the picture or, at the very least, make us reevaluate the narrative of history we were given. There's a medium ground between these two layers. These are subtle, unclear hints, recurring symbols in buildings, odd patterns in stained glass, and the placement of highways and monuments that improbably link historical sites. They resemble marks that allude to another painting underneath, brushstrokes that don't quite suit the composition as it is apparent. They appear to be coincidental to the untrained eye. They are indicators to the seeker that the official picture is lacking. When it comes to the Merovingians, history works like a purposefully incomplete canvas. These gaps are a manufactured void intended to maintain mystery as well as the actual lack of data. They make sure the audience is never completely content and is constantly eager for the next bit, which serves as the narrative's lifeblood. The biggest risk may not be in Dunknown, but rather in thinking we already see everything when, in reality, we are simply seeing a carefully selected fraction for exhibition. We give up looking for the painting since we believe it to be complete. At that point, the true tale doesn't just stay hidden, it stealthily disappears, not by repression, but by forgetfulness. Suppose that all of the Merovingian secrets are revealed at some point. Every secret document, emblem, every piece of evidence from centuries ago, their entire lineage, and their affiliation with the Knights Templar. What would truly change if the whole truth were revealed? Would it append Europe's religious and political underpinnings? Or would it just spark a fleeting interest before vanishing into the never-ending chaos of the digital news cycle? Restructuring our understanding of history itself may be the first effect. it would be necessary to rewrite the fundamental story of Europe, including the establishment of kingdoms and the interplay between secular and spiritual authority. This time, a chosen lineage that had been marginalized is making a comeback. Any revelation connected to the Merovingians' beginnings could lead to intense theological discussion and possibly even split the Church, particularly within the Roman Catholic Church. However, it's also feasible that how the truth is interpreted will have a greater impact than the truth itself. No amount of evidence can ensure widespread acceptance at a time where conspiracy theories and false information spread more quickly than the truth. It would be considered a momentous breakthrough. By some might reject it as modification or invention. The Merovingian enigma, whether solved or not, would then remain a legend, but in a different form. Not only will we know, but what will we do with that knowledge? That is the last question. Truth may be both a fire that destroys the fundamental pillars upon which civilization is built and a light that disperses darkness. Are we ready to accept the repercussions of viewing the big picture, particularly if it means letting go of centuries-old beliefs? This may be the most timeless element of the Merovingian tales. Instead of offering answers, it exists to raise questions. It will therefore continue to challenge us to consider the connection between memory, power, and history, whether or not the secret is ever made public. Forces that are always moving, yet not always apparent, like blood. Thus, at least for the purposes of this fiction, the voyage through the hazes of Merovingian history is over. However, like many great mysteries, the story endures in the unsolved questions rather than in the history books. Even while the past is sleeping, it is never really quiet. On this extraordinary journey into the warnings left behind by those who vanished, if you believe the past still holds wisdom, if you know deep down that history was never asleep only waiting, subscribe now to Secret Historian.